Well, there's another issue too that goes along with identity politics to some degree here, that this stratification of society is starting to reflect, because I pointed out earlier that the best predictor of long-term life success economically is intelligence and trait conscientiousness. But that also means that our culture is stratifying meritocratically. And there's some things about this that we really have to take seriously. And this is where some of the uglier elements of science become germane. So IQ is a particularly ugly aspect of science, because the IQ literature reveals that which no one would want to be the case, which is that there are profound and virtually irremediable differences in people's cognitive performance, and that those differences have a very solid biological and heritable basis. No one wants to hear that. They don't want to hear that it's biological. They don't want to hear that it's heritable. They don't want to hear it's permanent. They don't want to hear that it's irremediable and that it actually has a practical consequence. And no wonder they don't want to hear it. Well,
and even worse, they don't want to hear that it differs between genders and ethnicities. That is, to me, one of the most painful things that I've ever learned in my life, is this kind of information. It is one of the great heartbreaks when it comes to the dream of pure egalitarianism. And that is, I think, even harder. It's an even harder pill for people to swallow.
Yeah, well, the gender differences in IQ look relatively trivial, but there are differences in ethnicity that don't look trivial. The Ashkenazi Jews, for example, have on average a 15-point advantage over the rest of the Caucasian population, which is sufficient to account for their radical overrepresentation in positions of authority and influence and productivity. And I am, just so that it's absolutely clear, I am not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying there's a real reason for it that no one wants to contend with.
Well, and it's particularly, for the Ashkenazis, it's particularly focused on language abilities. And this this reflects their, quote, overrepresentation, although if you normalize by IQ, it's not the case in the arts, in novel writing, in speech writing, and so on. Ashkenazi Jews don't have a significantly strong advantage in spatial reasoning, which is one of the reasons why you'll hear a lot about Jewish writers, but not a lot about Jewish engineers. That talent seems to have spread to the East Asians in particular, this is why, 40% of Google's workforce is East Asian, because there are these biological differences. And this is something that has been so strenuously avoided since, I guess, the bell curve first came out 20 odd years ago. And I think the consequences of avoiding it, it's the old thing, gives you a short-term benefit, but the long-term catastrophes, I think, are still accumulating.
So one of the problems with the stratification is that, okay, so let me give you an example here. It's illegal in the United States to induct anyone in the armed forces who has an IQ of less than 83. And the reason for this is that despite the fact that the armed forces has been desperate for bodies since its inception and is still desperate, and in peacetime and in wartime, and that the armed forces has been used as a social mechanism for moving people out of the underclass into the lower middle class, let's say. And I'm pointing that out just to state forthrightly that the armed forces, above all, had every reason not to want this to be the case. They determined after approximately 100 years of study that anyone with an IQ of 83 or less couldn't be trained to do anything that wasn't positively counterproductive in the armed forces. And that should send a shudder of terror through everyone's heart, because an IQ of 83 puts you in the bottom 10% of the population. That's 1 in 10 people. And we're building a very cognitively complex society. And in that cognitively complex society, there's less and less room for the gainful employment of people who don't have the capacity to contend with cognitive complexity.
And if the army could train them and increase things and change things, to me, IQ is similar to height. There's some environmental factors, but you can't make someone taller than their genetics allow as a whole. And so if the army could change that IQ, they'd have a massive incentive to do so, but nobody knows how to do it on any perpetual basis.
We've also seen repeated attempts by scientists and let's call them biological engineers, technical engineers, to try to produce exercises that would increase IQ. And basically the data is pretty clear, and it's also dismal. If you train people on cognitive tasks, complex cognitive tasks, you can generally increase the degree to which they can perform a specific cognitive task immensely. So with practice, and you see this with video games because they're complex cognitive tasks, you can get unbelievably good at a video game, even something like a maze game, which is quite tightly associated with intelligence as a measurement. Like if you use May's performance as a measurement of IQ, it's pretty tightly associated with IQ. But despite that, that kind of training does not produce an increment in actual IQ, in general intelligence. And even if you train people across a bunch of different cognitive domains intensely, you don't get any generalization to IQ. And that's such a disappointing finding, because what you'd really hope, especially with computational technology, is that you could train people intensely to utilize their cognitive resources, using specific training exercises, and get a general increment. Just like if you train weights, you're going to get a general increment in strength. Doesn't happen. So we have a really profound problem that, again, no one's willing to talk about, and that's that cognitive stratification of society. And of course, that was laid out to some degree in the bell curve back in the 1990s. But see, on the liberal end, everybody wants to believe that everyone's the same and that you can just train anyone to do everything. And then on the conservative end, everyone wants to believe that if you just got off your ass and looked for a job, there'd be a position for you. And unfortunately, that's just simply not the case. And so there's something about that, well, I don't have a solution to that, but I at least can point out the problem.